But it's a little bit like the huge energy that's put out on trying to figure out who killed John F. Kennedy. I mean, yeah, who knows? And who cares? I mean, plenty of people get killed all the time. Why does it matter that one of them happened to be John F. Kennedy? If there was some reason to believe that there was a high-level conspiracy, it might be interesting. But the evidence against that is just overwhelming. And after that, it's just a matter, if it happened to be a jealous husband or the mafia or someone else, what difference does it make? It's just taking energy away from serious issues onto the ones that don't matter. And I think the same is true here.
There are even some on the left, like Noam Chomsky and Alexander Cockburn, who argue that this whole interest in the assassination comes from a Kennedy revival, a Camelot yearning, the yearning for a lost Messiah. I'm giving quotes. These are quotes right from Chomsky. Cockburn and Chomsky and others, they challenge the notion that Kennedy was assassinated for intending to withdraw from Vietnam or undo the CIA or end the Cold War. These things could not have led to his downfall because they were not true. Kennedy was a Cold Warrior, a counterinsurgent who wanted a military withdrawal from Vietnam only with victory. I have argued similarly in my book, Democracy for the Few, that in fact, indeed, Kennedy was a Cold Warrior and a counterinsurgent, and that he should not be romanticized as a progressive. Chomsky, Cockburn, and others claim that the change of administration that came with JFK's assassination had no large-scale effect on policy, not even on tactics. In other words, if Kennedy had lived, he likely would have fabricated a Tonkin Gulf casus belli. He would have introduced ground troops in a massive land war, as Lyndon Johnson did. He would have engaged in the merciless B-52 carpet bombings of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, as Richard Nixon did. He would have risked destroying his own electoral base, proving himself a mass murderer as bad as Nixon. Chomsky and Cockburn don't tell us how they know that. All we know is the one surviving Kennedy, the Robert Kennedy, in fact went a different way. He became an anti-war critic. He opposed the war. He broke with the Johnson administration, and he said that his brother's administration, his administration, had committed terrible mistakes. The evidence we do have, in fact, is that John Kennedy observed Cambodian neutrality and negotiated a ceasefire and coalition government in Laos, which the CIA refused to honor. They preferred to back a right-wing faction that continued the war. Chomsky says much about troop withdrawal. He just wrote a whole book on this, Camelot Revisited and all that. But he says very little about troop escalation, other than to offer Roger Hilsman's speculation that Kennedy might well have introduced U.S. troops, ground troops in South Vietnam. Maybe so, maybe not. In fact, the same Hilsman noted in the New York Times not long ago, and Chomsky doesn't note it, that in 1963, Kennedy was the only person in his administration who opposed the introduction of U.S. ground troops. He was the only thing preventing an escalation of the war. Forget the question of withdrawal or not withdrawal. He was a barrier in that sense. Whether or not there are certain left analysts who think Kennedy was or wasn't a progressive or liberal and thinks that the CIA had no reason to kill him or other people had no reason to be dissatisfied with him, the fact is, do they see it that way? Entrenched interests are notorious for not seeing the world the same way that left analysts do. In 1963, people in right-wing circles, including elements in various intelligence organizations, did not believe that Kennedy could be trusted with the nation's future. Now, some months ago on a San Francisco talk show, I heard a guy come on. It was on KGO, and he said, "I've never said this before. I never said it. It's the first time I'm saying it. But I worked for Army intelligence. And in 1963, I was in Japan, and the accepted word around then was that Kennedy would be killed because he was messing too much with the intelligence community. And when word came of his death, we were, all I could hear were delighted comments like, 'We got the bastard.'" What JFK's enemies saw was something different from what Chomsky and Cockburn have seen. They fixed on Kennedy's refusal to provide air coverage of the Bay of Pigs, his refusal to go in with U.S. forces, his unwillingness to launch another invasion of Cuba, his no invasion guarantee to Khrushchev on Cuba, his atmospheric test ban treaty with Moscow, his American University speech calling for a re-examination of our Cold War attitudes toward the Soviet Union, his unwillingness to send ground forces in a massive form into Vietnam, his antitrust suit against General Electric, his fight with U.S. Steel over price increases, his challenge to the Federal Reserve Board, his warm reception at labor conventions, his call for racial equality and responsiveness to civil rights leaders, reluctant responsiveness, his talk of moving forward in a new frontier. Erwin Knoll, the progressive, says that he admits he has no idea who killed Kennedy. But this doesn't keep him from asserting that the Oliver Stone film was manipulative and that Stone provided false answers. How do you know that, Erwin, if you have no idea who killed Kennedy? And the remarkable thing about Erwin Knoll and Noam Chomsky and Alexander Cockburn is they don't know a damn thing about the criticisms and investigation that's been made. We've said this again and again. In the rebuttals in the Exchange in the Nation, almost every one of them said Alexander Cockburn doesn't know anything about this case. He doesn't know anything about Lee Harvey Oswald, really. He doesn't know just some of the questions I brought up. They don't know anything. And they never deny it. They never say anything. They go on with their patronizing comments. Well, Chomsky, patronization and condescension. Cockburn with vitriol and venom. They go on attacking those who supposedly are idealizing Kennedy. The gullible U.S. public that Erwin Knoll talks about. Knoll condemns Oliver Stone for playing on the gullibility of the American people. See, he's not gullible. He's cool. He doesn't fall for this. He's so cool that he didn't even go see the movie, you see. The U.S. public has not bought the official explanation. 78% say they believe there was a conspiracy. And both Chomsky and Cockburn in the Nation, Chomsky in Z Magazine, and again in a letter in exchange with me, both of them dismiss that fact and point out the same identical analog. They point out that, in fact, over 70% of the people also believe in miracles. So, what does that prove? And what has that got to do with the question at hand? That people can have a stupid opinion about one thing doesn't mean they're stupid about everything. In fact, Chomsky and Cockburn are themselves evidence of that. In any case, the comparison is between two different things. They're comparing the public's gullibility about miracles with the public's unwillingness to be gullible about the official line of it being fed and shoved in their faces for 30 years. That's not gullibility at all. Alexander Cockburn and Noam Chomsky have told us that we must not reduce great developments in history to conspiracy. For then we lose sight of institution, class, and other systemic factors of American capitalism. I don't need them to tell me about systemic factors in American capitalism. I use a structural analysis in all my writings. But investigating the JFK conspiracy, we are not looking for an escape from something unpleasant and difficult. That's psychiatrist Noam Chomsky speaking. But we're hitting upon the nature of state power in what is supposedly to be a democracy. Conspiracy is not something that's in contradistinction to structural analysis. It is part of it. These guys will use conspiracy, they will use legitimacy, they will finance elections, they will use publicity campaigns, they will set up liberalish organizations, they will set up alternative trade union movements, they will use assassins and death squads, they will use every single conceivable thing there is. And this was one of the things they used. When they had someone who was giving them trouble, when they had someone who was standing in their path because he was a little too bright and too shiny, when they had an agenda to save Southeast Asia from communism, they would kill one of their own. And that is a tremendous revelation. It was a startling revelation to the American public to make them realize what kind of a gangster government and national security state we really have in this country and what it does around the world. A structuralist position should not discount the role of human agency in history. Institutions are not self-generating forces. The great continuities of corporate and class interests, that's Cockburn's phrase, do not happen of their own accord like reified, disembodied social forces. What the left critics do is that they mistaken the low political value of the victim, JFK, whom they hate and detest. Their big fear is that you're going to like him, with the high political importance of the issue and the implications for democracy. The revelation of the gangster nature of the state. I mean, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, back in 1894, was a conservative militarist. Clemenceau once conjectured that if his name had not been Dreyfus, he would have been an anti-Dreyfusard. Does that mean that the political struggle waged in l'affaire Dreyfus was a waste of time? The issue was quickly drawn between the right and the left, between those who stood with the army and those who stood with the republic itself and with justice. The same with Benigno Aquino. Aquino was a member of the privileged class in the Philippines. He promised no great structural changes. He was even more conservative than Kennedy. Does this mean that the Filipino people should have dismissed the conspiracy that led to his assassination as an event of no experience? So, just another ruling class pig, what do we care? Instead, they used it as ammunition against the hated Marcos regime, as a revelation of what that government was really doing. Archbishop Romero of El Salvador. He was a member of the Salvadoran aristocracy. He could not have made it to the top of the church hierarchy otherwise. When he was ordained, they came with presents. They hugged and kissed him. And the minute he opened up his mouth and made some critical remarks about the war and some favorable remarks about the poor, he was assassinated. I doubt if he hadn't been assassinated, the Salvadoran history would have been much different. Does this mean that solidarity groups in this country and in El Salvador should not have tried to make his murder an issue that revealed the homicidal gangster nature of the Salvadoran state? Instead of seizing the opportunity, some left-writers condescendingly ascribe a host of mass psychology motivations and emotional needs to those of us who are concerned about the JFK assassination. They psychologize about our illusions, our false dreams, our longings for messiahs and father figures, and our inability to face unpleasant realities the way they can. They deliver patronizing admonitions about our conspiracy captivation and Camelot yearnings. They urge us not to escape into fantasy. They are the cognoscenti who guide us and outleft us on the JFK assassination, a subject about which they don't know a goddamn thing, and whose significance they will never be able and have not been able to grasp. I have a different name for our interests. It is not JFK worship, it's not Camelot yearnings, as the left critics would say. It's not big evils and conspiracy titillation, as the mainstream media would say. Our interest is born of democratic struggle, a desire to know what is going on, a desire to have rulers who are worthy of our name and the name of democracy. Thank you.
John Judge opened the annual Coalition on Political Assassinations meeting of researchers and authors with remarks about left denial and double standards around the issues of conspiracy and assassination.
The other thing I thought, if you can bear with it, I'd share with you is a little bit of a character by the name of Noam Chomsky. Some of you have heard of this person. He's, as Mike Albert of Z Magazine says, the only left intellectual in America. I don't know which word with that to quibble with, but I think there must be a few more. But in any case, he's probably the most published and mentioned and listened to left intellectual in America. So here he is. This is a book that's just come out called Understanding Power, the Indispensable Chomsky. And it's kind of an interesting book because instead of it being his lectures, where he sounds exactly as he sounds when he writes, this is him in question and answer sessions. So you actually get a little spontaneity and a range of topics from the crowd. And, it's a kind of interesting mix. And certainly he has things to say. But this particular section in here, and it's interesting too that this book, the footnotes are not included in this book. They give a website on the back of the book to go to look at the footnotes. So that's a new publishing feat, and saves you paper. But this particular section is called Conspiracy Theories. And someone in the audience says, Noam, you mentioned earlier how conspiracy theories take up a lot of energy in the left movements these days. I don't know any leftists that spend any time listening to them. Particularly on the West Coast and with respect to the Kennedy assassination, and you said that, in your view, it's totally wasted effort. Do you really feel there's nothing at all worthwhile in that kind of inquiry? I'm doing this so you can see how this logic works, because it's a powerful one and one that's kept us out of a lot of the discourse in the alternative press. Well, let me put it this way. Every example we find of planning decisions in the society is a case where some people got together and tried to use whatever power they could draw upon to achieve a result. And if you like, those are conspiracies. So that's the first straw man. Everything's a conspiracy. That means that almost everything that happens in the world is a conspiracy. If the board of directors of General Motors gets together and decides what kind of car to produce next year, that's a conspiracy. Every business decision, every editorial decision is a conspiracy. If the linguistics department I work in decides who to appoint next year, that's a conspiracy. Okay, obviously that's not interesting. All decisions involve people. So the real question is, are there groupings well outside the structures of the major institutions of the society which go around them, hijack them, undermine them, and pursue other courses without an institutional base and so on and so forth. So this is the second straw man. To be a conspiracy, you have to be totally outside the structures of power. And that's a question of fact. Do significant things happen because groups or subgroups are acting in secret outside the main structures of institutional power? Well, as I look over history, I don't find much of that. I mean, there's some cases. For instance, at one point, a group of Nazi generals thought of assassinating Hitler. Okay, that's a conspiracy. But things like that are real blips on the screen as far as I can see. Now, if people want to spend time studying the group of Nazi generals who decided it was a time to get rid of Hitler, that's a fine topic for a monograph. Maybe somebody will write a thesis about it, but we're not going to learn anything about the world from it, and at least nothing that generalizes to the next case. It's all going to be historically contingent and specific, and it'll show you how one particular group of people acted under particular circumstances. Fine. I read that to Bill Kelly, and he howled. He's found 4 direct connections between the plotters in the Hitler assassination situation and the John F. Kennedy assassination, including Mary Bancroft, Alan Dulles' mistress, who spirited Grontius, the major plotter, out of Germany at the end of the situation. But there are many others, and she, of course, is good friends with Ruth Paine's mother. But these are blips on the screen. And if you look at the place where investigations of conspiracies has absolutely flourished, modern American history, I think what's notable is the absence of such cases. At least as I read the record, they almost never happen. I mean, occasionally you'll find something like the Reaganites with their off-the-shelf subversive and terrorist activities, but that was sort of a fringe operation. And in fact, part of the reason why a lot of it got exposed so quickly is because the institutions are simply too powerful to tolerate very much of that stuff. And as far as the Pentagon goes, sure, the services will push their own interests, but typically they do it in a pretty transparent way. Or take the CIA, which is considered the source of a lot of these conspiracies. We have a ton of information about it. And as I read the information, the CIA is basically just an obedient branch of the White House. I mean, sure, the CIA has done things around the world, but as far as we know, it hasn't done anything on its own. There's very little evidence, in fact, I don't know of any, that the CIA is some kind of rogue elephant, off on its own doing things. What the record shows is that the CIA is just an agency of the White House, which sometimes carries out operations for which the executive branch wants what's called plausible deniability. In other words, if something goes wrong, we don't want it to look like we did it, those guys in the CIA did it, and we can throw some of them to the wolves if we need to. And that's basically the role of the CIA, along with mostly just collection of information. It's the same with the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, and all the other things that people are racing around searching for conspiracy theories about. They're just nothing organizations. Of course, they're there. Obviously, rich people get together and talk to each other and play golf with each other and plan together. That's not a big surprise, but these conspiracy theories people are putting their energies into have virtually nothing to do with the way the institutions actually function. The Kennedy assassination cult is probably the most striking case. I mean, you have all these people doing super scholarly, intensive research and trying to find out just who talked to whom and what the exact contours were of this supposed high-level conspiracy. And it's all complete nonsense. As soon as you look into the various theories, they always collapse. And there's just nothing there. But in many places, the left has just fallen apart on the basis of these sheer cults. So then this man in the audience has the perspicacity to ask the next question, which I always say, ask Chomsky, and here he goes. Well, there's maybe one exception, though. What about the Martin Luther King assassination? Now, tell me if this is the same person you just heard speaking. That's interesting. See, that's the one case where you can imagine pretty plausible reasons why people would have wanted to kill him. And I wouldn't be in the least surprised if there was, in fact, a real conspiracy behind that one, and probably a high-level conspiracy. I mean, the mechanisms were there. Maybe they would have hired somebody from the mafia or something to do it, but that conspiracy theory is perfectly plausible, I think. And it's interesting. I'm not aware that there's been very much inquiry into it. Or if there has been, and I haven't heard about it. But in the case of the one that everybody's excited about, Kennedy, I mean, nobody's even come up with a plausible reason. In fact, that's a pretty dramatic contrast, isn't it? The case of the King assassination is on its face very plausible, and the case of the Kennedy assassination is on its face extremely implausible, and yet look at the difference in treatment. Well, I hate to tell you, but the people that unearthed the King assassination are the people that unearthed the John F. Kennedy assassination. And if you think that the CIA is a little organization that waits for the next president to come in and tell it what to do, I suggest you come down to D.C. sometime. Those agencies last in perpetuity since they were created in 1948, and the presidents come and go. It's like Bill Moyer's trying to tell us that the problem is that with the government is that we have these otherwise legitimate government functions, but every once in a while to get something done, they have to dip their hands in the dirt and hang around with these gun runners and drug runners and these people they really shouldn't associate themselves with. And if they just stopped doing that, things would be okay. Whereas my view of the secret government is that it is the gun and drug runners and it is the criminals that are the government, and they in turn get some people in three-piece suits to stand up and pretend to be the government on their behalf. But you see, if you take this position that it has to be totally outside the structures of power, then of course it's meaningless. But it isn't outside the structures of power. It's the way it works. It's business as usual. And, we know that from our own study of the history. And to say that it's useless to study the details is striking enough. But the bottom line for Chomsky is, do you like the guy or not? If you don't like him, it wasn't a conspiracy. And that's really what it comes to. He doesn't think from his left critique of Kennedy that Kennedy was worth killing. Kennedy was just a ruling class bastard like the rest. He had it coming, he was doing all the dirt, so why bother studying it? And if you think that killing the president could make any difference, you don't understand how class structure works. You don't have to understand how things happen, and you're just a starry-eyed liberal to think it makes any difference, and they wouldn't have killed Kennedy because, after all, Chomsky didn't like him, and he wasn't worth killing. But it's not the left critique of Kennedy that makes any difference. It's the right critique of Kennedy that makes the difference. It's not what Chomsky thought of him. It's what Curtis LeMay thought of him, because Chomsky isn't going to shoot him, and Curtis LeMay would. And that's the difference, and that's what you have to look at. You can go down the South today, and you can see in the homes of the poor, on the wall, pictures of Jesus, Martin Luther King, and the Kennedy brothers. Now, you can stick your leftist nose as far as you want in the air and say that was false hope, but it was hope. And it was a hope they knew was moving people, and they knew that Kennedy was responding to popular movements, and it's that hope that they meant to kill in Memphis and in Los Angeles and in Dallas here in 1963. Because there was somebody for the last time, and the two things I'd say is the last president that actually responded to the public will since that time, and also the last one that had enough brains between his ears to make them worth blowing out. And this attitude, turns around completely when you talk about King. And that's why I say, ask these fellows from the left who say there's no such thing as a conspiracy to explain the King assassination. And suddenly they become wilder conspiracy theorists than us. Because after all, there was a reason to kill Martin Luther King. Well, let's see this weekend if we can figure out if there was a reason to kill John F. Kennedy.